Hi all, I'm Chris and welcome to this two-player playthrough of the board game Cave Troll, published by Fantasy Flight and designed by Tom Jolly. Cave Troll is a competitive strategy game of manoeuvring, fighting and looting for 2 to 4 players. Each player commands a party of heroes striving to amass as much wealth as they possibly can before time runs out. To thwart your opponents, you can wield powerful artifacts and summon deadly minions to stand in their way, including the terrifying Cave Troll itself. The player who dominates the Cave Troll's lair and gains the most gold wins. Okay, so let's set up the game. First things first, we're going to put the playmat in the central play area. Next, we're going to shuffle and set aside the 6 cards of the artifact deck. We'll just put that over there for the time being. Each player is then going to choose a colour. For this run through, we're going to have one player as the red player and one player as the yellow. Now, players are then given this handy little double-sided cheat sheet. Just goes in to the abilities of each one of your characters and the monsters during the course of the game. Now, there's 2 variants, the classic game, which we'll be playing today, and then a more advanced variant game on the other side. So both players will keep that nice and handy. We'll just set this off to the side. Now that both players have chosen their colour, we're just going to give them their components for the game. First things first, we set out their scoring counters and we put these on the 0 space of the game board. Both players are now going to take their respective player decks. Now there's 19 cards in both decks and they are identical. So we're just going to shuffle these up and place them to the side. Now we're going to set out the figurines for the players. First things first, we're going to put out our 9 adventure figurines for both players. Like so. Next we'll set out our 4 hero standees, the knight, the dwarf, the barbarian and the thief. Now these miniatures are considered our hero miniatures and they're identified by their circular round bases. Now, due to the overhead camera not being able to pick up the detail of each individual miniature, during the course of the playthrough, we will highlight which miniature is which on the game board. And lastly, we're going to set out our 3 monsters and our treasure chest. So we have the orc, the wraith, and the cave troll. And as you can see, these are all identified by their square bases. Lastly, each player draws their starting hand. So we'll just move these decks a little bit over. So the yellow player has drawn an adventurer and the red player has drawn a knight. Okay, so we'll just widen the shot here just to get everything in. We're set up and we're ready to begin the game. Okay, we're set up and ready to begin. A game of Cave Troll is played over a series of turns, beginning with the first player and then going clockwise. We'll have red as our first player in this regard, and normally on a player's turn they could perform 4 actions. Now these actions they can repeat if they so want, and the 4 actions available to them are as such. They can draw and play a card, and we'll get to that during the course of the run through. We'll go through each of these the first time we actually do them. You also can move a character on the board into an adjacent space. Now you'll see the board's divided by those stone walls. You can't travel through them, but you can pass through these wooden doorways. You can use an ability on a player's card. So certain cards will have an ability on them. You can use those abilities as an action. And lastly, if you're lucky enough to gain an artifact during the course of the game, you can play an artifact that you've collected, and that's your 4th option. Now the game scales up with escalating actions. What's meant by that is for the first 3 turns of the game, you are restricted to how many actions of whatever the turn it is. So case in point, red on their first turn will have 1 action, yellow will have 2 actions, back to red for 3, and finally yellow has the full spectrum of 4 actions. And likewise from that point onwards, both players will have the 4 actions available to them. But For the first turn of the game, red's going to have one action, and they're going to draw and play a card. So they draw their card, and it's an adventurer. Now they've got the choice of playing either the adventurer or the knight. Now, adventurers are our generic miniatures. They have no special powers to them, whereas our knight is one of our 4 specialised characters. And with that being the case, we're going to hold off playing the knight for this point in time. We'll go more into detail about his abilities once he does deploy. So we will draw and play a card, and we're going to play the adventurer. So we grab one of our 9 adventurers. Now, our human characters or the round-based characters can deploy on any staircase in the game. And we have 4 staircases available to us. We have this one in the top left-hand corner, this one over here in the right, this one, and that. So we have the 4 where you can deploy your characters to. So at this point in time, we'll deploy this adventurer to that spot there. Now, when you draw and play a card, you would then discard it normally to your discard pile, except in the case of what we have here. Now, certain cards will have an hourglass symbol at the bottom of the card. What's going to happen is we're just going to set them off to the side in their own pile. Once we've accrued 5 hourglasses, that triggers a scoring of the whole game board, and we're going to tally up who has control of what section and award them the appropriate gold. So at this point in time, our adventurer card we'll just put over there, and we have 1 hourglass accrued. Over to the yellow player. Now the yellow player has 2 actions available to them. Their first action, they'll draw and play a card. They draw their card. So they have 2 adventurers. They have one with another hourglass symbol and one standard. They'll hang on to their hourglass symbol at this point in time in the hope they can optimize that to score points in the future. So they'll just play their standard adventurer. That goes to their discard, and they're going to deploy an adventurer. And they're going to deploy down to this staircase down here. Back to the red player. The red player, turn 3 of the game, now has 3 actions available to them. First action, they'll draw and play a card. Okay, so we've drawn the score a room card. So what we can do, we can play that to score any one room, and that adds towards our total hourglass as well. We don't want to play that because no characters are actually in a room to score a room. So we'll hang on to the score a room card, and we'll deploy our knight. Now, in looking at the knight's card, he has a bit of text here which says opposing characters except other knights cannot enter the knight's room. Now, exception to this, we will see during the course of the game, the cave troll can override, is the strongest strongest miniature in the game, and can override that rule. But any of the human characters or the circular bases and all other monsters cannot enter a knight's room except for another knight. Now, the second part of his text is when the knight enters a space that contains any orcs, remove all orcs from that space. When a card or a rule refers to removing, that is from the game. They're taken back to the general supply. So we'll deploy our knight. We'll grab the appropriate miniature, and we'll just place him up on this staircase up there. Now that card is discarded. Now I just realised that's 1 action for the red player. The yellow player should have had 2 actions available to them. They only did the 1. They only drew and played a card. So as their second action, what they will do, they'll move their figure. Alright, so now that would have settled the yellow player's turn. Back to the red player. They've only had 1 of their possible 3 actions. For their second action, they'll move their adventurer figure into that room. And for their third action, they'll move their knight into that room. So that finishes the red player's turn. It's going to be back to the yellow player. Now the yellow player now has the full 4 actions available to them. And likewise, the red will from this point onwards as well. Yellow player decides to draw and play a card. They're going to draw a card, and they've got another adventurer. So they've got their 2 adventurers. Again, at this point in time, they don't want to really add the hourglass to the display because red definitely dominates area control at this point in time. So they'll just play a standard adventurer for their first action, and they'll play that adventurer to the bottom staircase here. For the second action, they'll move this adventurer into that room, adjacent room, and likewise for their third and fourth actions, they'll move this adventurer 1 space for the third action and 2 spaces for the fourth. So now yellow controls 2 rooms worth 4 gold coins. That's the end of yellow's turn. Back to red. Red has their full 4 actions to use. First 2 actions, we're going to move our knight. We're going to move our knight 1, 2, so that's 2 actions. We have 2 actions left to us. We're going to draw and play a card. So we get a wraith. Now if we look at the wraith card, we look at the text here. When the wraith enters a room, push 1 character from that room to an adjacent space. Now that is just a standing ongoing ability when the wraith moves around the board. Now his action, so now we if we do deploy the wraith onto the board, we could use his ability as one of our actions during the course of the game. We can push 1 character from the race room to an adjacent space. So not only his ongoing ability of when he moves firstly into a room, we can move existing characters sharing a room with the wraith to another room. So we'll get the wraith onto the board, we'll play the wraith card, and we'll keep score room for the time being. Now monster cards, which are named as such on the game card itself, are a bit different with their deploy. Monsters will deploy from these well spaces, and we've got 3 on the game board. So we'll deploy the red player's wraith, and he'll just deploy over to this well space here. So the red player has 1 action left available to them. They'll move their wraith into this room here. Now his ongoing ability is he can push a character from his room. He'll push this adventurer into this adjacent room, which limits him only to 1 coin instead of the 4. That's the end of the red player's turn. Back to the yellow. Yellow decides to draw and play a card. We're going to draw a card and we get the barbarian. Now the barbarian, if we read his text, the barbarian counts as 2 heroes when its room is scored, and the barbarian cannot be pushed by the wraith. So as we saw here, when the wraith pushed the standard adventurer from a room, the barbarian is immune to that power. Now his first part is he counts as 2 heroes. So when we do eventually score the room, it's going to be an area control. However many heroes that player has in a room. So heroes are going to be basically our humanoid characters, or the round-based characters. They're going to count for scoring rooms. So the barbarian on his own, if you've got majority in a room, his single figure is going to count towards 2 figures for scoring. And with that being the case, I think the yellow player will play their barbarian. We'll discard his card and get his matching figurine, and we'll deploy the barbarian to that spot there. So that's our first action. For our second and third action, we'll advance the barbarian into the wraith's room. So now that barbarian counts as 2 figures in the scoring, but the wraith wouldn't count anyway because he is a monster. So now the barbarian controls this 4 coin room. So we've used up 3 actions, we've got 1 action left available to us. We'll draw and play another card. And we've drawn our own wraith, the same as the red player. So we'll play the wraith card, and we'll deploy our own wraith over to this well here. And that's the end of the yellow player's turn. It's back to the red. First things first, red's going to draw and play a card. So we get the treasure chest. When we look at the treasure chest, we get to place our treasure chest in any room. The treasure chest increases the value of its room by 4 gold. So what we're going to do, we're going to play the treasure chest now. We're going to take the miniature and we're going to put the treasure chest up with our knight, who's controlling that 5-point room. So in essence, when it comes to scoring, that treasure chest is going to increase our 5 points of gold to 9. Now, you'll also notice our treasure chest has our hourglass, so it goes towards our tally up here. We now have 2 hourglasses. That's the first turn. Onto our second turn, we're going to draw and play another card. And we get an adventurer. But at this point in time, I think we will play our score a room card, which is an event, and we get to score any one room. So we'll play that. Again, it does have an hourglass figure. It goes towards our tally of 5 up here, but we're going to score this room here. Since we've put the treasure chest in there, and it's now going to score 9 points. So red opens the account. For their third action, they're going to draw and play another card, and they've drawn their own barbarian. And I think red will play the barbarian, and we'll deploy the barbarian to this space here. And as their last turn for this round, they're just going to move their barbarian into that adjacent room. That's the end of the red player's turn. Back to the yellow player. Yellow player is going to draw and play a card. So they've drawn their own treasure chest. And like the red player, they will play this, and they'll deploy their treasure chest to the barbarian's room down here, thus increasing the 4 up to an 8. That goes to our tally. We're now at 4. We only need one more timer, and that will trigger a scoring of the board. Second action for the yellow player, they're going to draw and play another card, and they get another adventurer. So now they've got 2 adventurers to them. If they were to play their initial adventurer, which did have the sand timer, that would trigger the scoring of the board, and we would do that instantaneously. Now, if the yellow player looks at the current board situation, red is going to score 9 points for here, another 2 for there, so that boosts them to 11, 15, so 15 points total for the red at this point, as opposed to the yellow, who currently stands at 8, 9, 13. So the yellow player is still going to hold off on playing this timed adventurer at this point, and they'll just play a standard. So they'll deploy a standard adventurer, and they'll deploy him to that top corner. Okay, their third action, they'll move their wraith into this room here, and for their fourth and final action, they'll move their wraith into this room. Now the wraith's ongoing power, he's going to force this miniature into an adjacent room. So we'll just force that miniature down to there, thus decreasing red's total control from 4 in that room down to 1. That's the end of the yellow player's turn. Back to red. Red player's going to draw a card and play a card, and they get their orc. Now when we look at the orc has an action that we're going to be able to trigger as one of our 4 actions during a game turn. Now his action is he gets to remove 1 hero from the orc's room. So the orc is a good predator miniature. He can go through the room and systematically remove other miniatures. So at this point in time, red is going to play his orc card. He's going to play the orc, just discards it. And we place our orc. We're going to deploy from this well here. That's our first action. For a second action, we'll move the orc into this room here, thus guarding that room. Third action, we'll move our barbarian into that room there, thus increasing his scoring potential from 2 to 4. And for a last action, we'll draw and play a final card, and we get another adventurer. So we have 2 adventurers in our hand. We'll keep one and we'll play the other. So we'll discard that adventurer to deploy. And at this point in time, red's got good control of this top right hand quadrant of the board, so they'll deploy their other adventurer to there. That's the end of red player's turn. Back to yellow. Yellow's going to draw and play a card. So they draw their cave troll, the most powerful card in the game. If we look at the text on the cave troll, his ability is when you place your cave troll figure in any room. So the cave troll does not need to be placed in a well. Each player may move one of their characters from that room to an adjacent space, and all other figures are removed. So he's just going to drop in. Both players both friendly and enemy are going to be able to move one figure from that room. The others are going to be taken out and put back to the supply. Now, characters cannot enter the cave troll's room. So in essence, what he does, he drops in and he protects that room for the entirety of the game. And it doesn't take much thought for the yellow player to see he does not want the red player to score these 9 points at any given time. So he's going to deploy his cave troll to that room, and thus the red player is forced out. Cave troll's played. That's yellow player's first action. As their second action, because at this point in time they're not scoring anything for them, they will move their adventurer to this adjacent room. Now, as much as yellow would love to utilise their wraith to push this barbarian, again the barbarian's power is he cannot be manipulated by a wraith, so that barbarian is safe there. So for their third action, they'll draw and play another card. Okay, so they've drawn their dwarf. We look at the dwarf's ability. When the dwarf's room is scored, the printed gold value is doubled once for each dwarf in the room. So if a player could potentially get their dwarf into an opponent's dwarf's room, for each dwarf in the room is doubled their score. So in essence, 2 dwarfs in there, but say the yellow player had majority, the value of that gold would double twice with the 2 dwarfs in the room. We haven't seen the red player's dwarf as yet. So the yellow player has the way up. Do they play their adventurer, trigger the scoring for the board, or do they deploy their dwarf? Due to the cave troll's intervention, I think they will play their adventurer. So they'll hang on to their dwarf for the time being, and they will deploy their adventurer. So they'll play the card, and we'll put this adventurer down to this bottom staircase. Now, that would go to our pile over here, thus getting 5 hourglasses. So we're now going to score the board. Just remembering, monsters or the square-based characters will not score a room, only the round hero characters will. And in doing that, we'll first score the yellow player. Now the yellow player is going to score 2 gold for this point here, 4 gold for here, so that's 6 points, a single point down here, so we have 7. The treasure chest is going to double the value in this room to an 8, so we had 7 and 8, so we ended up with 15 points. Now the red player, we look at their layout of the board. We have a single gold coin here, 4 points for the barbarian, so that's 5, and the knight also has a room. So that's 6 points for the red player, which puts them equal on 15 with the yellow. But that was an advantageous time to trigger the scoring because they did get maximum points available to them, more so than the red player. These cards are reset. They can go to each player's discard pile. And we're going to start that timer off once again. Now the yellow player has 1 turn left available to them, and they will move this adventurer into this room here. That's the end of the yellow player's turn. It's back to the red. First things first, red player is going to move their adventurer into this room. Then they're going to draw and play a card. They draw their card, and they got another adventurer again with the hourglass symbol, which could start our timers back off again. And the red player is going to go on the offensive. Instead of just isolating their characters to this part of the game board, they're going to come down here and put a bit of pressure on the yellow player, who is monopolising control of all these spaces. So we'll play this adventurer, we'll put that up to the top corner, and they'll deploy one of their adventurer characters to this bottom staircase. So that's their second action. Third action, they'll move this character in here. And fourth action, they'll contest and move into this room here. So now the 4 gold coins have 1 hero each. Again, when it comes to scoring, it's majority. So at this point in time, no one would score those 4 gold coins. Back to the yellow player. First thing the yellow player is going to do, they can see the intent of the red player. They're going to move their Wraith into this place here. Now the Wraith's ongoing ability, he's going to push a character from that room. When he does enter it, he's going to push this red miniature over to there. Second action is the yellow player is going to draw and play a card. And they get an adventurer card, so now they have the choice between their adventurer and their dwarf. Again, the dwarf's power is when the dwarf's room is scored, the printed gold value is doubled for each dwarf in that room. So as the game is accelerating, I think the yellow player will deploy their dwarf and try and get them into the game. So we'll play the dwarf and we'll deploy the dwarf to that stairwell. And for their final two actions they have, we're going to move and move again. So now the dwarf is in the room with 5 gold. So if that is the score and it is uncontested and the dwarf is in there, that's a possible scoring point of 10 points. Back to the red player. Now the red player wants to optimize his orc's potential. So he's going to try and get that monster on the move. He's going to spend his 3 actions to move the orc. 1 onto the staircase, as monsters can travel onto staircases. The humanoid characters, however, cannot travel onto well positions. So we've moved the orc 2 spaces, 3 spaces, and why not? We'll use all his actions in the movement. We'll move the orc 1 more time to move into this room here. So that's the 4 actions spent. Now the orc's ability is not like the race. It is an ability that needs to get triggered as an action. It just doesn't automatically happen. So we would have to, in a future turn, the red player would have to trigger the orc's ability to remove a miniature from the board. He's set up to do so in a future turn. It's back to the yellow player. Yellow player is going to draw and play a card. So they've drawn their own orc. So they've got the choice of deploying their orc or another adventurer. I think they'll hang on to their orc and see how things progress, but they will deploy their adventurer. So we'll discard that card and deploy an adventurer, and we'll do that again to this top corner. That's 1 action. Second action, we're going to move this adventurer into this adjacent room, thus securing 3 gold coins. As a third action, we'll move the adventurer we placed initially into this room here, and again we might move that miniature again as our 4th action just down into here. That's the end of the yellow player's turn. Back to the red. Red player is going to use their first action to trigger the orc. So again, his ability is to remove 1 hero from the orc's room. So not push like the wraith, but remove. So this adventurer is returned back to the yellow player. That's 1 action for the red player. Red player is going to continue to go on the offensive. He's going to use his orc again, and for his second action he's going to move into the room with the dwarf. As his third action, he's going to trip his ability again. He's going to remove the dwarf back to the yellow player's supply, and lastly he'll advance 1 more space into this room here. Now unfortunately for the yellow player doesn't have their knight on the board at the moment, because the knight is the counter to this orc where he could remove him from the board. It's back to the yellow player. Yellow player is going to draw and play a card. So they're going to draw a card, and it's another adventurer, this time with the hourglass symbol. Now this is a bit of a no-brainer. They're going to start playing their orc to the board as well. Otherwise, they need to deflect some of this focus that the red player is placing on their own troops, and hopefully return the favour to the red player. The only disadvantage to the yellow player is the red player does have their knight figure on the board who can counter this orc's attacks. But they'll deploy their orc, discard that card, and they'll place their orc on the centre well. As their second action, they'll activate their orc. They'll move him into that adjacent room with the opponent's barbarian. For their third action, they'll use the Orc's power to remove a hero, thus returning the Barbarian back to the red player's supply. And lastly, they'll draw and play another card. So they draw another Adventurer. They've got their Adventurer with the Hourglass. There is only one Hourglass at this point. So they'll deploy an Adventurer using the Hourglass card in the hope that they can get a better area control by the time that does reach the 5. So we'll place that one out there and we'll deploy another Adventurer. We'll place him on this staircase there. That's the end of the yellow player's turn. It's back to the red. Now the red player is going to continue with an attacking gameplay. They're going to use 2 actions to move their knight, 1 space, 2. Now when their knight, as we said, his ongoing ability is when a knight enters a space that contains any orcs, remove all orcs from that space. So back to the yellow player. Third action, we're going to trigger our own orc's ability to remove this Adventurer from that space, and again push forward into this adjacent room for their 4th action. Back to the yellow player. Yellow player is going to do some moving of their own. They're going to move this Adventurer into this space here, thus claiming 4 gold during the scoring phase, as they are uncontested. They're going to move for a second action this Adventurer into here, claiming another 4 gold. For their third action, they're going to draw and play a card. They've drawn another Adventurer, so they now have 2 Adventurers in their hand. So they'll play one of them to deploy, and they want to deploy as far away from this orc as they can possibly. So again, they will deploy in the top left-hand corner. And their final action, they'll draw and play again. And then finally, they get their knight. So this is a no-brainer. They need to stop this orc from picking off their characters. They will play their knight to this staircase. That's their 4th action. Back to the red player. Now unfortunately for the yellow player, the red player still has a turn up their sleeve before the yellow player can engage their knight. So they're going to continue on with their culling of the yellow player's miniatures. They're going to enact the orc's ability, and they're going to remove this Adventurer from the board. That's 1 action. Second action, they will move into the Barbarian's room, and as their third action, they will remove the Barbarian. Just to reiterate, the only monster that the Barbarian is immune to is the Wraith's Push ability. So as their 4th and final action, red player may take this Adventurer and move them down into this bottom corner. Except the 1 gold, they've now got the 3. That's the end of the red player's turn. Back to the yellow. Now the yellow player wants to enact a little bit of revenge on this orc, so they're going to engage their knight character. First action, they're going to move their knight into that room. Second action, they move their knight into the orc's location. Now in doing so, they then remove that orc from the spot. Now that doesn't count as an action, that's just their power, that when they enter a room with an orc, they get rid of it. So they still have 2 actions up their sleeve. This Adventurer in the top left-hand corner is not doing anything for them at this point in time, so they will move that Adventurer down to that space. So that's the third action, and their final action, they'll draw and play a card. Now, they can score a room if possible, or they can deploy another Adventurer. So the yellow player is going to score a room, and again, if we look down at this room here, only the round-based figures or hero figures count during determining who has control of a room. So this red wraith has no control in this room. Yellow can score it, which they will. They put that card over there as it does have a 3rd hourglass towards our 5. And they're going to score this room. Again, the treasure chest will boost the value up by 4. So yellow player scores 8 points. And breaks this deadlock and moves to 23 points. The adventurer stays in their hand, and it's back to the red player. Now, due to the red player's very aggressive gameplay, their deck is a lot thicker than the yellow players. They've played a lot less cards because they have been moving their miniatures around the board. Now, that's a bit of a danger to the red player because they haven't utilised their deck, and the yellow player is down to their last 3 cards. Once that is depleted, that will trigger the end of the game, and currently the yellow player is in a lot better situation. So the red player, for their first action, is going to draw and play a card. They get an adventurer. So they've got their 2 adventurers. They'll play one of them to deploy. They'll deploy to this top staircase. For their second and third action, they will move this adventurer into this 3-point scoring room there. And for their final action, they will draw and play another card. So it's another adventurer. They'll discard that, and they will spawn another adventurer to the top space up there. That's the end of the red player's turn. Back to yellow. Now, yellow players very happy with the placement of all their miniatures at this point in time, so they will start their turn as their first action by drawing and playing a card, and they draw their thief. If we look at the thief card, the thief's action that we can trigger as one of our 4 is we get to place the thief on any room or staircase that does not contain an opposing knight. So that's pretty good. The thief can jump around the board and deal with certain hot spots around the board as a defensive character. So it'd be silly not to take advantage and get her on the board in case we do need her to counter something the red player will do. So we'll play the thief. Again, she does need to deploy to a staircase. That is an action triggerable as one of our 4, not as her initial deploy action. So we'll just place the thief on this staircase here as our first action. Second and third action, we'll move her down into this bottom room, thus scoring 3 gold. And for our 4th and final action, we'll draw and play another card. So we're down to our last card in our deck, and we've got another adventurer. So we've got our 2 adventurers in our hand. We'll play 1 adventurer as our final action, and we'll play this adventurer to this spot up here. Back to the red player. Red player will spend 2 of his 4 actions to move this adventurer up into this top corner, thus securing the 3 gold coins. For his next action, he will draw and play a card, and it's another adventurer. So we will play that adventurer to deploy another. I think he'll play that to the bottom space there. And for his 4th and final move, we will move this adventurer into this room there, sharing the space with the yellow player. Back to the yellow player. Yellow player, as his action, will draw and play a card. And we get find an artifact. So it's an event. So we will definitely play the artifact card. So what it tells us to do is to draw the top card of the artifact deck, look at it, place it face down in front of you for use, for later use. That moves up to here. It's got 2 hourglasses, so we're now at 2, 3, 4, 5. We are going to score the board, but we'll take the artifact card before we do that, just as a reminder. Now if we look at the artifact, we've picked up the Idol of Eldar. It's going to be worth 4 gold if we do play it, which we will. Take all opposing heroes from one room and place them on any staircase. So the yellow player has definitely lucked upon that. We'll just place that face down there. Now the yellow player has only performed 1 action at this point in time. So we're going to score the rooms because we have triggered the 5 sand timers, and we'll tally the yellow rooms first. So if we go up here, we have 2, 5, 9. We lose this one because it is contested, so no one's going to score that 5 points there. We come down to our thief, which boosts us to 12 points. And then we come finally over to our barbarian, our knight. So we have 12 plus 8, 20 points total for the yellow player. So they go from 23 to 43. Red player scores. We've got 3, 6, 9, 13, 17, 20. So they go to 35. We can return these cards to the player's discards. Now, unfortunately, even though the yellow player did grab this artifact and he still has, in essence, 3 actions he would normally have available to him, by triggering the end of the game, having no cards left in his deck, that does end the game immediately. Now, a bit of a silver lining for the yellow player, because he did end the game, he gains an additional 3 gold. Now, it's not a total loss for the yellow player, because any unused artifacts that a player could possibly have, he will gain his 4 gold coins for that as well. So pushes the yellow player up to 50. That can just go back to the discard. He wasn't able to action its power. And finally, we score the game board for the last time. As before, yellow player, we've got 3 points, 5, 9, 10, 11, 12, and the 8 points for the final room. So 20 points total, gets us to a total of 70 points. And the red player, we have 3, 6, 9, 13, 16, 20, for a total of 55. So even though the yellow player was copping a beating through a good portion of that game from the red players, Orc miniature, he did hold out and in the long run won the game. I hope you've enjoyed this playthrough. If so, possibly like and subscribe, and until next time.